Another very strong motive throughout history is bearing witness, particularly for people who can't speak for themselves. Writing about people, telling the stories of people who have been muted or silenced or even exterminated, and being the one to tell their stories in some historic form or as journalism or as fiction or poetry. I think that's a very strong impulse. When I began writing, the field of what women would write about was really kind of narrow. And when I first published my novels, which have a kind of sociological or political agenda, I was told by some reviewers, quote, I should leave the novel of social unrest to Norman Mailer. Actually, that was a review. That I should leave the big novel, I should leave to people like Norman Mailer, which I thought was very funny. And I thought, well, Norman Mailer has his own novels, which he's doing, which are very different from what I'm doing. Women were expected to write more about household and domestic issues and family life, which many women do very, very beautifully. But I wasn't really interested in the domestic novel. But I'd never really let that bother me. Always look into the background of one's family if you go far enough back to immigrant ancestors. You'll probably find something happen, something going on that was pretty violent, because lots of things happened in the 19th century. Today, things are a little more reported on. You can't get away with murder today. In those days, you could give a baby away. Nobody cared. There were no... You didn't have to adopt. I mean, there were no social services didn't exist. There were no social workers. Lots of things went on that are not talked about. For instance, I've written a lot about domestic abuse and wife battering, and what we call wife battering didn't exist. Domestic violence didn't exist. Date rape didn't exist. None of those terms that are common today, they didn't exist. Because if you were raped by somebody whom you knew, that wasn't considered rape. It was probably consensual. There was no way you could get a police officer to pay any slightest attention to anything like that. Girls were made pregnant who were very young. It's just considered that they were consensual, or nobody cared. I mean, basically, if you were 12, 13 years old and you were raped, you might get married. You have to marry your rapist. Nobody cared. There would be nobody would make any arrests. Then within a family, if a father got drunk and beat his whole family, the police didn't care. Police would not come out at all. It sounds a little fantastic today, but the police would not cross this threshold. They considered domestic violence didn't exist. The father could beat his children, sometimes pretty badly, and it would be very rare for the police to do anything. Now, we lived next door when I was a girl to a family that was terrorized by their own father. So I was friendly with a girl with a family like that. I've written a lot about this. I remember my own father going next door and trying to stop this violence, and how my father almost got killed. This man had a gun. And my father should not really have done that, but he heard all the screaming next door. He went over. He could have died. And I remember this man who was drunk, who shot his own dog. And the dog died in the backyard when I was like 6 years old. So I remember all these things going on, and there were no police officers, and nobody would ever think of calling the police. So when I write about these subjects, they're really very haunting to me. I'm thinking about the girl next door who's my friend, and she was almost my age. She was a year older, and she had a family. And some of those people were written to me who got out, you know, and that girl wrote to me for years. And so I'm sort of still in contact with that world. If one can face the darkest elements in oneself and things that are secret and buried, I think there's a great deal of power. I can give you an example of a great work of art that is great because the writer was writing about a forbidden subject. it was absolutely taboo. He could not write about it openly. Oscar Wilde in The Picture of Dorian Gray. Now that's a novel about homosexuality and the repression of desire. Oscar Wilde was in love with some young man. He could not express that in any open way. There were laws against sodomy that might have actually resulted in death. He might have been put to death. So the novel is a reaction to the taboo. It's a great novel. It's actually one of the great novels in English literature of its time. But I think it's only powerful because it's so forbidden and you don't know what's going on. So Dorian Gray is this very pretty boy. He's just so beautiful. He's described as beautiful. And every man who sees him sort of falls in love with him. But Oscar Wilde doesn't say that. He doesn't use those words. So Dorian Gray is seduced by an older man, but not in those words. We don't really know what's going on. Then Dorian Gray gets involved with somebody himself, and he becomes a predator. But he always stays young. Everybody else gets older. He's this pretty boy. And finally, he's like, I don't know, he's like 85, 90 years old. He's still this pretty boy. And at the end of the novel, he dies. And they see this picture up in the attic is this elderly, wrinkled, putrescent, syphilitic, rotted-looking, horrible picture. So that's his soul. The picture of Dorian Gray's soul is all this rotted flesh, but the face of Dorian Gray is still this boy. So that's a good example of a writer confronting taboo, but he knew he couldn't write about it directly. Now, if these men could have lived open lives and didn't have to be subversive about their writing, would they have been as good writers? That's a question. Now, I would think maybe not, particularly in the case of Oscar Wilde, because being elliptical gives you a lot of power that being head-on and direct would not have. It's a very interesting paradox, I think, that the most powerful writing often comes from areas that are repressed, that one doesn't want to talk about, but it's so irresistibly interesting for people who share that predilection, let's say, or share certain obsessions, that you will have almost like a guaranteed audience of a number of people if you write about certain subjects that have not been written about very much. Because each subject that's taboo and hasn't been discussed or is considered vulgar or awful or unnatural, all those subjects relate to many people who share in them, but they have no outlet. So immediately you'll have a readership which may be surprising. So people who publish memoirs on certain subjects, especially in the past, were just astonished at how many readers they had. Mary Carr writes very openly about her own alcoholism, and she writes about her parents' alcoholism. So her memoir her first memoir is called The Liar's Club. That was a phenomenal bestseller, and I don't think Mary Carr expected that at all. That kind of openness about drinking and about being a teenager and having parents who were drunk, and then drinking herself, that hit a nerve of candor in women, young women, that probably nobody had written about before. In every area of something that is considered unspeakable, there are many people who are waiting to hear about it. Obesity, bulimia, feeling that one's body is very ugly or too big or something. All those subjects have people yearning to share what they feel, but they have no outlet. Mainstream literature and conventional forms of beauty are so dominant. We have the image of like the perfect woman or girl, the perfect man, the physical fitness mania, a certain healthy attitude toward life. predominates in our culture, but there are all these other people who don't live up to that, and they feel maybe resentful, they feel intimidated, they feel imperfect. So all those people are yearning to have a spokesperson. One very evident example is William Styron wrote about depression and Darkness Visible. That's probably 25 years ago. His memoir was also an enormous bestseller. I don't think Bill Styron, whom I knew, had any idea that so many people would buy his book. He felt that he was a failure. He felt he was suicidal. He couldn't write. He was depressed. I mean, he was so depressed, you know, that he managed to write that memoir, but he felt he was a failure. He couldn't write fiction. And yet, in writing that memoir, he became an enormous bestseller. And I have a friend, Jonathan Santlofer, who doesn't feel like a failure, but he lost his wife very, very abruptly. And Jonathan went into a kind of emotional tailspin. But I suggested to him, and maybe other people did too, but I said, why don't you write about it? Because there are no memoirs by widowers, almost none. So he did. He wrote the widowers, a widower's notebook. I think his book is called The Widower's Notebook, Jonathan Santlofer. And that's become another surprise bestseller, I think. And Jonathan has discovered, he gives readings, and men come up to him and say that their story is like his, but they have nobody to talk to. So tapping on these secret audiences is something that is the consequence of writing about Taboo.